Go ahead and get started with this section then, inshallah. Okay, so this next section, I'm not sure if I'll be able to cover it before all of it before Maghrib, but I'm going to give it a shot. So if you have been, you found what we've been talking about so far a bit philosophically dense, it's about to get even more complicated, okay? But inshallah, we'll try to break it down as much as we can, as powerful as possible, okay? This is our, you can say, our first argument for the existence of Allah. All of that, you know, we talked about the metaphysical backdrop, we talked about burden of proof, implications. Now we come to our first actual argument, okay? Now, just as a reminder, remember, rational arguments are not an end, they're a means to uncloud the fitrah. Okay? I just want to kind of reiterate that, is that sometimes when we get into a debate or a discussion, the point isn't to win the debate, it's to win the first part. Okay? Really important, because sometimes you say, okay, well, this is the proof, how could someone not see it? You're a fool, that's it, conversation over. Sometimes that's not what they need something else. So I always want to kind of caution us when we get into these, you know, more philosophically intense, proof-based conversations. Okay. All right. So this is the argument from dependency for God's existence. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with a summary of the argument itself. We're going to define what we mean by dependent. We'll look at the argument. We'll look at the Islamic tradition. We're going to respond to a few objections. And we'll try to end on a spiritual note depending on time. And we'll try to take some questions. Okay. I don't think we'll be able to get through this section before Maghrib. We'll break for Maghrib. We'll have to come back for it. So maybe that's a good thing. We'll have some time to let the content marinate. All right. Now I want you to imagine a certain scenario. I want you to imagine that you come outside your house in the summer, right? Not now. Okay, and you see this trail of dominoes, and we're watching this trail of dominoes, and you see that there's dominoes that are falling back, and as they're falling, the last one comes and falls right in front of you. And so now you walk back to the beginning of this trail of dominoes, okay? And you walk, and you're walking, this long trail of dominoes, and finally comes the first domino, okay? No one's around. Now, that first domino, did it cause the chain itself? Well, it's not a philosophical question. Answer it like you would answer. Okay. No, right? It is the explanation for that particular chain of events. Is that first domino responsible for that? No. It's something outside of that first domino that is not the domino that is needed here, right? So in essence, this is the argument. This is the simplest way I can put it, okay? So this particular argument, if you've understood the dominoes, inshallah you'll understand this. Now, I'm going to give a summary of the argument itself. I'm guessing it will not be very clear at this point, but don't worry, we're going to delve down much further into it. We're going to do things like define dependent. All right. By the way, this particular argument is also known as a contingency argument. We use dependent just for ease, right? It's also a contingency argument in the Islamic tradition. It's for those of you who are interested. It's called, the argument is known as wajib, right? But anyway, so here's a summary of the argument. The universe and everything we perceive is either independent, dependent on something else dependent, or dependent, or is okay, so let me start over. Is either independent, dependent on something else dependent, or dependent on something independent and eternal. Right? Number one, that's our first. Number two, so this, let me just take a step back for a second. We set this up as a deductive premise. So you've got two premises and a conclusion, meaning you're going to say two different facts, and from that, you're going to come to a conclusion. So the first one is a premise. Second one is a premise. The last one is the conclusion. Okay? That's what we mean by the argument. Okay? So the first premise, the first thing we're stating, the universe and all we perceive is either independent, dependent on something else dependent, or dependent on something independent and eternal. It's one of these three things. Okay? Number two, the universe, all we perceive cannot be independent or dependent on something else dependent. Therefore, the universe and all we perceive depends upon something independent and eternal. I'll tell you something. I was listening to some of the audio recordings for this class, and I was driving my minivan with my kids in the back, and all of a sudden my 8-year-old, he comes up and he says, Baba, what is this independent? What is this? Makes no sense. I'm like, yeah, I know. All right. So if you're having that feeling, don't worry. Right? You're gonna define dependent and all of that. So like I said, we're just stating the argument right now, but we're going to now go piecemeal, slowly, inshallah, and go through it step by step. Okay. Now, let's start with defining what we mean by dependent. And I want to stop here for a second. There is the word dependent that we use in conversation. Okay. What we're doing is we're giving that a philosophical definition. So yes, there's some relation between the English word dependent and how we're going to define dependent philosophically, but you have to park your definition of dependent, put it aside for a second, and just focus on what we mean by dependent for this particular argument. Clear? Okay, because what happens is people start, conflating the two, and then that gets very messy. Right? So how are we going to define dependent? Let's start with number one. Something that is dependent is not necessary. Okay, now we need to define philosophically what we mean by necessary. What we mean by necessary is that it is impossible for that thing to have not existed. Okay, let me repeat that. It is necessary means that it was impossible for that particular thing to have, for it to have not existed. All right. In other words, things that are not necessary did not have to exist. All right. So let's take an example of what we mean by this. Okay. So up there you see an egg carton. Now let's say you open the fridge, you find this egg carton, and you find this pen on the egg carton. Now, when you open the fridge, does that egg carton necessarily have to be there? No, it could have been somewhere else, right? Did it necessarily have to exist? It could have not existed, right? Did the pen have to be on top of it? No, right? The egg carton with the pen on top of it is not necessary. Now, the fact that it's not necessary means it needs an explanation outside of itself to explain it, right? It doesn't explain itself. Clear? Okay. So once again, necessary means that it's impossible for it to have not existed. In other words, that things that are not necessary didn't have to exist. Okay. You can take that with pretty much anything. So is this remote necessary? No, it could have not existed, right? Okay. Something outside of this remote is needed to explain its existence, right? Something. So it doesn't explain itself. Clear? Okay, that's number one. So something that's dependent is not necessary. Okay? All right, let's move on. There's another section of this. Okay. Number two, when we define something as dependent, we're saying that its fundamental building blocks could have been arranged in a different way. So let's pretend now that you come across, you're driving down the road, you see this arrangement of flowers, it says love. Okay? Could those flowers have been arranged differently? Yes, it could have been arranged as whatever, right? It could have been arranged as something else, Fahad rocks or whatever, right? Something else could have been written there. It's not necessary, it could have been rearranged in some other way. Is its own presence and its own arrangement, does it explain itself? No, something outside of that arrangement has to give an explanation for that arrangement. It doesn't explain itself. Make sense? Okay. And again, you can apply that to anything, right? The arrangement of the items in this iPhone, could they have been arranged some other way? Yes. Does the iPhone itself explain that arrangement? No. Something outside of the iPhone has to explain the arrangement. So far, so good? Okay. Next one. All right. And this is actually ties into the explanation. The fact that you can't explain, it doesn't explain itself, means it relies upon something outside of itself for its existence. Is that clear? Okay, so far we're at 3, one more. All right. Number 4, it has limited physical qualities. What that means is that when you have something that's physical, you have something like an object, it has certain physical limitations, all right? It has a certain shape, it has a certain size, it has a certain color, it has a certain charge. And these limited physical qualities, did it give itself those limitations? No, something outside of it gave it those limitations, right? So the 4th definition, part of our definition dependent, is that it has limited physical qualities. So far, so good? All right, any questions up to this point?
I'll explain what it means to be
Dependent, right? We're explaining the term dependent. Okay, that's all we're doing so far. Okay, so let me actually go through them real quick one more time. Okay, just so we're on the same page. We said when we define dependent, number 1, we said something that is dependent is not necessary. It could have not existed. Okay, and if it exists, there needs to be something outside of it that gives it an explanation. You know, that it, okay, it exists, that's something outside of it. It doesn't explain itself. Number 1. Number 2, the fundamental building blocks could have been arranged in a different way. Okay, and you can take anything, that chair right there. All right, the fundamental building block could have been arranged some other way. Yes. Does it itself explain the arrangement? No. Something outside of that chair has to explain the arrangement. Okay. Number 3, it relies upon something outside of itself for its existence. Just like an explanation, it has to be something outside of itself. It doesn't explain itself, it doesn't come up with itself. Okay. And number 4, it has limited physical qualities. The physical limitations, you know, it has a certain size, a certain charge, a certain shape, and it didn't give itself those limitations. It requires something outside of itself for those limitations and for an explanation of those limitations. Okay, so we've understood dependent now. Clear as day. We're going to put all of y'all to the test. All right, shall we? Okay, we're going to take this very concept of dependent and apply it to the whole universe. Okay. Number 1, the universe and everything. So let's go back to what we were talking about earlier. The universe and everything that we perceive do not necessarily exist. It could have not existed. Yeah. Does the universe necessarily have to exist? It could have not existed. Yes or no? Yes. Okay. The fundamental building blocks of the universe and everything we perceive could have been arranged in a different way. Possible, right? They could have been arranged some other way. Planets could have been somewhere else, whatever it might be. They could have been arranged some other way, but they have a specific arrangement. So you need an explanation outside of the universe that explains that arrangement, that explains existence. Okay. Okay. Now the universe and everything we perceive has limited physical qualities. Yes or no? Of course, right? Everything that we perceive in the universe has a certain shape, certain size, certain charge, certain color. Did it give itself those limitations? The universe and everything in it? No, right? Okay, it requires an explanation outside of itself that explains its limited physical qualities, that explains its existence, that explains its arrangement. Yes? Okay, if that is the case, what we're saying is that the universe and everything that we perceive, actually, before I get there, the universe, everything we perceive is dependent or independent? Dependent, okay? Now, here's the thing. Up to this point, most people would agree with you. But this is where it gets a bit sticky. Number 1, so let's go back to the argument where we started off with. Okay, we said, number 1, the universe and all we perceive are eternal, necessary, and independent. Is this possible? Good question. No, why? Okay, that's one, you could have non-existent. Give me another one. Why is statement number one not true? So it could have not existed, what else? Okay, it doesn't explain itself, okay, number three, another one. Change is not what we spoke of. So it could have been the building blocks could have been arranged in a different way. All right. There's one more. Physical limited physical qualities. It didn't give itself a limitation or an explanation to those physical qualities. So statement number one, it's not possible. All right. The universe and all we perceive depend for their existence on something else. Okay. So if it requires an explanation outside of itself, that thing that's outside the universe, that is also dependent. Does this make sense? Is this possible? Okay, why would that not be possible? Okay, so we said the universe, everything that exists is dependent, right? We said for the 3 or 4 reasons we gave, that the universe, everything in it, has limited physical qualities. It could have not existed. It has certain building blocks that could have been arranged in a different way. All of that requires an explanation outside of it. Therefore, the universe, everything in it is dependent. Okay? Dependent on something else for an explanation, for arranging the building blocks, meeting the quality. That thing that's outside the universe, if we say that is also dependent, can we say that? Is that true or false?
We could say yes.
You can say yes, okay.
Fine.
Wait. Okay, there has to be something independent. Why? What if someone says, you know what?
Dependent on something else that hierarchy is.
Okay.
When you really look at the top, the zenith of that pyramid,
Okay.
it has to.
It has to. Why?
Because otherwise you're just in that cycle of dependence.
Okay.
There should be somewhere it starts with intent.
Because you say so.
Logic.
Logic. Okay. Go ahead. So because it has to be stopped.
Yeah, that should be.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. Anybody else? I mean, he's right. I'm not saying he's wrong. You want to kind of articulate it with a little more sharpness. So you're right. But let's articulate it in a way where someone can say, okay, you know what? Absolutely. Because someone can say, well, no, you just have dependence forever. Right. That's what we're talking about. But my question is, how do we articulate it in a way where someone's like, okay, that has to be, there has to be something. Yeah. Yeah. So when you say that, okay, so are human beings themselves dependent or independent? They're dependent. Okay. So this is exactly what we're asking. Does the universe, everything that's in it, does it depend on something else that's also dependent? That's the exact question we're asking. So our two brothers over here said no, because then you could say, you know, there has to be something that's independent at the end of some sort of chain. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So according to what you said, does everyone agree with that? Or did everyone hear what you said?
No.
So you said like a computer program would come up with a computer program. So therefore, there's nothing that would precede the computer program. Is that what you said? Is that valid here?
Even there, somebody needs to have written that basic, that the first program.
Right, okay. Because someone could say the programmer himself is. Okay, let's because of time. Let me just kind of summarize it because you're both right, It's just we want to be able to articulate it in a way that is more robust and very clear. So what we say is, philosophically, if you were to say you have something that's dependent and it's dependent on something else dependent, you enter into what's known as an infinite regress or an infinite regress of past events. Okay, now let me give you an example for us to kind of understand this. So I used to be a really big fan of chai, right? Desi chai, chai. Okay, I used to have like 6 or 7 cups a day with that. Sugar is insane. Anyways, I gave up the habit. Okay, let's assume now I go to my wife and I tell her, I say, could you please make me a cup of chai? And she says to me, look, I don't mind doing that, but I need to ask your mom. So my mom says, look, I don't mind. She can make you a cup of chai, but I need to ask your mom. Of course she does. So my dad says, okay, look, I don't mind, but let me ask your chai. Let me ask your mom. Okay. My uncle says, look, I don't mind. I'm going to ask my friend. His friend says, look, I don't mind, but I need to ask my mom. His mom says, look, I don't mind, but I need to ask, my husband. Husband says, look, I don't mind, and I need to ask my roommate. And this goes on forever. Will I ever get a cup of chai? No. Okay. That's what we call the infinite regress events. You have to, like you said, be the stopping point. So you can't say something dependent on something else dependent that's on something forever, because then you wouldn't exist. The universe wouldn't exist, right? So if that's the case, our third conclusion, the universe, all we perceive, depends on their existence for something else that exists by its own nature and is eternal and independent. That's the most rational explanation. Okay. Now, what we're saying is we haven't said that thing that's eternal and independent is God, right? All of these we mentioned. All we're saying is that you cannot jettison the idea of God, right? There has to be something that's independent and eternal in order for us to even be here and have this conversation. Okay? That, in a nutshell, is the argument from contingency. Okay? Now, so is that clear before I get on to some of the contentions? Yes? I'll tell you something. I taught this particular argument in UT Austin, the MSA over there. And I was mentioning this a little while ago, that Austin is UT Austin is a very liberal campus, connected Berkeley. And so you have a lot of atheists there, although in Texas in general is more of a Christian community, but in Austin specifically, you have a lot of atheists. So the MSA there was like, look, man, we need something that's just really going to help us at our Dawah table. And so when they got this argument, they loved it. They actually, in fact, went out and bought a set of dominoes and actually used it as a prop to explain the argument of dependency. And alhamdulillah, a few people actually came to Islam by way of that Dawah table, right? So they loved the argument. And the reason is, well, there's a number of reasons, is that it is a very difficult, I don't want to say impossible, but it's a very difficult argument to downplay. You can't reject it. That's why it's had so much kind of, throughout our own tradition, this argument of wajibul wujud, it's been kind of extant for as long as we know, right? From the very beginning when we started the argument. Yeah? Anyway, okay. So, let's look at some contentions. What if someone says, what if the universe was eternal? All right, what do I mean by that? If the universe has always existed, does that negate the argument? Does it mean that the universe is not independent anymore? No, you can still say, even if you said it was eternal, let's say that you said the universe is eternal, right? You would still say it's dependent. Why? It can't explain itself. It still has limited physical qualities. All the things we just spoke about. So even if we gave it to you, said, okay, yes, the universe has been here forever, right? Even though that's a problem because of what we mentioned in past events, even that does not negate the argument. You still cannot say that the universe is independent. Yeah. Okay.
But it's something, if you define something as dependent, requiring explanation, not an existence.
Yeah.
by definition requires storing
Sure.
of sort.
Right.
So saying that it's kind of like, I'm not saying the question, it doesn't have it's asking for a contradiction.
I agree with you. And that's why we're saying it's a contention to an argument that they can't really do anything with, right? These are possible contentions that people come up with, not that they really have much weight, right? So, but this is something that someone comes up with. So what if it was just, it was just eternal? We've always been here. Okay, well, but it still doesn't take away from the dependent nature of the universe. Yeah. Okay. What time did you say Maghrib was? 4:20. 4:20. Okay. So, so let's go to take care of the conclusion, and then we'll break for Maghrib, inshallah. So, okay. So all that we sense depends upon its existence on something that exists by its own nature and is accordingly eternal and independent. It's independent because if it were dependent, it would require an explanation. It's eternal because if it was not eternal, finite, it would also be dependent. It's kind of like what you were saying, right? So as finite things require an explanation for their existence. Therefore, we can conclude that the universe and everything that we perceive depends upon something else that is eternal and independent. And the best explanation for that would be God. I know there's a little bit of a logical leap here, but you have to then give us a different explanation, right? And in terms of also other areas, right? Like, so what is that independent thing? How do we know it? And so on and so forth, of which there's other evidences that we will get. Make sense? Okay, we'll break here for Maghrib. You guys need to make wudu or whatever it is. We'll come back, we'll take some Q&A, and we'll move on. Okay? All right. I actually covered that in time. I'm actually very impressed with myself. Well, say mashallah, mashallah. Alhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalam ala rasulihi kareem abad. All right. So I'm going to congratulate myself because that is actually record time that I've covered the contingency argument. So either, mashallah, you guys are extremely intelligent, and I've done the same thing I've always done, or I'm just that amazing that I covered it that fast and totally understand the argument. So a friend of mine is here. He's like, I have to totally understand the argument. That's great because everyone here has understood it. So we're going to get one of these guys later on to just explain it to you. Right? Inshallah. Okay, I want to just conclude the section with some reflections on the Islamic tradition. Okay, so obviously a lot of this discussion can be very cold and clinical. Okay, because we're talking about philosophy, we're talking about necessary, not necessary, dependent, and so on and so forth. The Islamic tradition, when it speaks about dependence and independence, in fact, is very rich and it's not clinical in the sense that it's not cold, cerebral, clinical. It actually adds a degree of spirituality, obviously, right? So when we speak about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being independent, the term that's used in the Quran is Ghani, al-Ghani, right? That he is the one that's not in need of anything. So there's an ayah in the Quran, there's actually a few ayahs in the Quran, I'll just mention one of them. So for instance, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhan nas antumul fuqara ila Allah. Indeed, O mankind, you are in need of Allah. You are impoverished before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَهُوَ الْغَنِيُّ الْحَمِيدُ. And indeed, He is the one that is free of all needs, and He is the one that is praiseworthy. Okay? Now, just a reflection on this particular ayah. Again, I'm moving from the cold cerebral, session we just had, just to highlight why in the Islamic tradition it's actually a lot more spiritually touching. Because if we think about our own lives, many times what happens is that we forget that we are fuqara in Allah, that we are faqir before Allah, that we are totally dependent upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sometimes the day-to-day that we're engaged with, we tend to forget that, right? If you work a job and you get a paycheck every 2 weeks, pretty soon you start forgetting that, okay, wait, your dependence is upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? What's interesting is when you look at the people of the past, because their lives were so much more precarious and more difficult, they had this very deep understanding of their total dependence upon Allah, right? My brother told me that he was when he was studying at Medina University. And if you know about Medina University, there's it's like the United Nations of the Islamic world, like people all over the world that come there to study. He said that he was in his dorm room once and he walked out and went to there's a collective bathroom there. He said he saw a student and he was looking at the sink and he was turning the faucet on and off. So my brother asked him, he said, like, turning the water on and turning it off. Like, he said, like, we're wasting water for, like, he's turning it on and turning it off. He said, after we spoke for some time, he goes, I realized this was the first time he had seen running water. You know? And so for him, it was just a novelty. You just turn on the faucet and water goes out. Because, you know, I come from my village, we have to walk miles, collect water, bring it back to my village, and then we drink water. Right? So now if you think about a person that's in that context, how in tune they are with their limitations, their dependency, and how much they understand Allah's independence, that fact that Allah is okay. That and so what is the result of forgetting that you are God? The result is that you actually it has a negative impact on soul. Okay. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Kalla inna al-insana. Indeed, right? Know that the human being, like the Stobian. Stobian is when, like, you know, you have something that goes beyond the limit. So you think about a glass of water, you fill the glass, and it's just, you're filling it beyond the limit. Stobian. Why does the human being do that? Why does he go beyond the limits? Why does he sin against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? The ayah continues, he considers himself self-sufficient. When a person forgets that they're Allah, that's when you run into trouble. That's why, you know, you start sinning against Allah. You go beyond boundaries, right? And that in the modern world is at its apex, right? I mean, just something like running water, we don't think twice, right? Just maybe move, you probably think, okay, well, you know, subhanAllah, that we actually have this, the ease that we can do this. You know, I'm guilty of this myself. So, you know, I remember some time ago. So when I was a teenager, I wasn't the best of teenagers. All right, I'm going to leave it there. You can ask me the details there. Okay. So I was in such a state that we were saying, what? He's this bad. Let's ship him off to Pakistan. Okay. So for those of you who are from Pakistan, there's a certain phenomenon that happens. Okay, and this doesn't matter what city you live in, but it's throughout the entire country that I didn't know about. And this phenomenon is called load shedding. Anyone know what this is? It's where in the middle of the day or the middle of the night, all of a sudden electricity just goes. Okay, I had never been exposed to this. I was this bratty American kid that's like, you know, going to Pakistan and, you know, just being shipped off over there. So middle of the night, all of a sudden, like, you know, it's midsummer and Pachanga, like everything's off. Like I wake up in this pool of sweat and I'm like, no electricity. So I you know, I'm inquiring, like, yeah, this is very common, still shitting, whatever. They're this American, right? It's like, what is going on? You know, long story short, I thought, you know what, I have rights, American, I deserve recognition, right? It's my God-given right as an American. So I went out to the car, turned on the air conditioning, and went to sleep. Okay. Needless to say, 5 minutes later, my dad walked out, started banging on the window, and it was a good story after that. So I'll leave that there. Okay. Point being, so many things that we take for granted that we forget our status and our state of being totally dependent on, right? When at the end of the day, whatever you have, whatever you know, if you think about your own self, we're nothing. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is totally independent. He's not in need of anything. And so when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings us back and says, Ya oh mankind, you are impoverished for Allah. That's a statement of like total impoverishment. there is no second that you can't do without Allah, that you can't do without the mercy of Allah. Totally dependent. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is totally independent. And these concepts, or these, when we speak about these things, there's actually a deep link between how we understand the independence of Allah and how do we understand all of the names and attributes of Allah. Okay? So I'll give you kind of one tidbit here, like a theological tidbit. And that is this. When we are looking at the names and attributes of Allah, especially when we're trying to understand them and explain them in the English language, one thing that has come up kind of over and over again is that we tend to abstract some of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay? And when I say abstract, what I mean is you take one name, you focus on it, but you don't realize that it's a part of the entirety of Allah. So when we talk about the names and attributes of Allah, we talk about them as that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is maximally perfect in all his names and attributes, such that there's no deficiency in any of the other names and attributes. Okay? Now we're going to delve into this, inshallah, in the next section. But for right now, understand that yes, Allah is Al-Ghani, but he's also Al-Rahman, Al-Wujud, and so on and so forth. Salam, Sabur, and so on and so forth. All the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when you understand them, this kind of wholeness of oneness, it's actually very profound, right? And that's the reason I'm saying that, because I want to section that off. I mean, I want to have that be a bridge to what we're going to speak about next, which inshallah will be the problem of evil. Okay, so I'm kind of switching around some of the sections. That said, because some of you said, like, when are we going to get to that? So I'm going to switch that up. I'm going to get into that section next. Before I do that, with this section concluding, does anyone have any questions? Everyone.